Early in the morning of the 9th of June 1925, a timber worker walked along a quiet rural road in South Dublin. Preparing for the long day of labour that lay ahead, he collected his horses from a nearby field and made his way towards the crossroads of Blackglen Road and Ticknock Road. Little did he know that he was about to discover the scene of a crime that would both shock and fascinate the people of Ireland. As he drew closer to the crossroads on that warm summer morning, he noticed a well-dressed young woman sleeping at the side of the road. Contemplating this strange sight, he took a few more steps until he noticed a woman's leather shoe lying in the gravel. Instinctively, he turned around, and as he approached the seemingly tranquil woman, he realized, to his horror, that her pink blouse was stained red. In the weeks and months that followed, two men, one a respected doctor and peace commissioner, the other a superintendent in the newly formed Irish police force, were arrested, held in custody, and eventually put on trial for the murder of Honor Bright. The revelations of the subsequent trial revealed a shocking tale of debauchery and immorality that scandalised the ultra-conservative society of 1920s Ireland, featured on the front pages of national newspapers, and drew huge crowds of curious Dubliners who were eager to witness the trial. At the spot on Ticknock Road where the sinister events of 100 years ago unfurled, a small plaque on a granite wall that is passed by unnoticed by thousands of people every day bears the inscription, "Honor Bright, the 9th of June 1925, rest in peace." When Honor Bright made her way to Dublin in 1918 from a small Carlow village, she carried with her the hope of a new and independent life that so many young women of her generation dreamt of. What she found, however, was a judgmental and unforgiving society in which she strived to make a life for herself and her child as a single mother. Ultimately, she would be exploited and betrayed by people in a position of trust and authority, and her life was cut short in the foothills of the Dublin Mountains. In this film, we will search for her true identity, retrace her footsteps on that fateful summer night, examine the suspects arrested for her murder and their subsequent trial, search for her final resting place, and learn of the astonishing theory developed by her granddaughter that implicates Ireland's most famous poet in her murder. This is the sad story of the life and death of Honor Bright. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next upload. These videos take weeks to research, film, narrate and edit, so I would greatly appreciate if you would consider sharing the video with a friend or family member who you think would enjoy the story. Honor Bright must have seemed like a mysterious character to those who knew her after she arrived in Dublin. Although she quickly made friends in the city, she rarely spoke of her former life in rural Ireland. The name that appears on the plaque in Ticknock was not the one given to her at birth, and, as we'll find out, was one of several she would use during her lifetime. Born in a small hamlet in County Carlow called Granddaughter, about 10 kilometres south of Carlow town, on the 11th of June 1900, she appears on the register of births for that year, followed by the 1901 census the following year when she was 10 months old. The census tells us that she is living with her parents and 5 siblings in house number 23, Granddaughter, and it is in these documents that we learn of her birth name, Mary Kate Neal. Head of the household was her father, 50-year-old Michael Neal, a blacksmith, and her mother, 38-year-old Catherine Neal. As we can see from the census, both Mary and Kate were family names for the Neals. Her mother's name was shortened to Kate, and her older sister was Mary Ann, so to avoid confusion, she quickly became known to her family as Lily Neal. Graignaspidog is surrounded by an expanse of seemingly unending pastures, but despite the beauty of her place of birth, life was difficult for the Neal family, and Lily's early years would be marked by tragedy and loss. In a few short years of her birth, Lily would lose both of her parents, and as we will see from the 1911 census, the role of head of the family was taken over by her older brother Patrick. Her father Michael died in 1903 and was followed by her mother Catherine, who died of exhaustion in 1908. The 1911 census shows 5 of the siblings are still living together in Graignaspidog, although they have moved a short distance away to house number 14, and head of the family, Patrick, is working as a farm labourer. At this point, Lily Neal is only 11 years old, while the rest of her siblings are adults. For the remainder of her time in Carlow, she would continuously lose her brothers and sisters. This time, it was not death that took them away, but rather the promise of a new life in America. We can see here also that her official name has changed from Mary Kate to Catherine, although she is still known by her family as Lily. By the time she turned 18, her family connections to Graignaspidog had dwindled dramatically, and Lily found herself almost alone in the world. It was then, in 1918, that she took the brave decision to find a new life for herself in Dublin City. Lily Neal had been 16 years old when the 1916 Rising took place, and within a year of her move to Dublin, she would be an eyewitness to the Irish War of Independence, followed by the Civil War, and then the birth of the Irish Free State. During these turbulent times in Irish history, the independence that she had to learn as a child helped her to find work and accommodation in the city. She soon found herself a job in a ladies' clothing store on Kildare Street, and in her spare time after work, she often attended dances where gentlemen could pay her a small fee for the privilege of a dance. Life must have become exciting for Lily, and her quiet days in Graignaspidog must have seemed like a distant memory as she twirled around the dance floors of Dublin and men vied for her attention. Her life was about to change dramatically, however, when, in 1920, she realised that she was pregnant. She was not engaged or married, and the father of her child was nowhere to be seen. She must have realised at that moment what lay ahead. When her employer found out about the pregnancy, Lily was immediately fired. Not only did she lose her job, but also her lodgings and food, as they had been provided by her employer. To be a single mother in 1920s Ireland was scandalous and deemed utterly unacceptable by society. Once again, Lily found herself alone. Faced with almost no options, she was determined to find a way to keep her child and her independence. The likelihood of finding another job was practically nil. She now had no reference from her previous employer, and word of her story would quickly spread through the small city. In the 1920s, Dublin had a population of approximately 350,000 people. That's about 1 million fewer than today. so it was really impossible for her to hide in the crowd. She faced the prospect of entering the workhouse or one of the newly formed mother and baby homes, where conditions were dire and it was likely that her baby would be taken from her. On the 9th of November 1920, Lily gave birth to her son in the Coombe Maternity Hospital. A week before the birth, a young IRA volunteer by the name of Kevin Barry was executed by British forces in Mountjoy Jail. He had been captured by the British Army following an attack on an army supply truck and was only 18 years old when hanged. Kevin Barry was born in Dublin, but spent a large portion of his childhood in Rathvilly, County Carlow, not far from Lily's home. The execution outraged the people of Ireland and also Lily, who decided to name her child Kevin Barry in his honour. Against all the odds, Lily managed to keep her baby. She found a home on Catherine Street and lived there for a time with a kind woman named Margaret McGill, who helped her to care for her son. Lily was unable to stay in Catherine Street permanently, but Kevin Barry remained with Margaret McGill after she moved out, and Lily paid her a weekly fee of £1 for his upkeep. She was now in an impossible position. She needed money to pay for her son's care, but it was not possible for her to find another job. It was about this time that she began to work as a prostitute on St. Stephen's Green and Grafton Street. It was also around this time that she created a new identity for herself. To her clients and acquaintances, she became known as Honor Bright, but to her closest friends, she became known as Lizzie O'Neill. When writing about somebody who went by several different names during their lifetime, it's difficult to decide which one to use when telling their story. It seems to me that the few people she knew well and trusted called her Lizzie O'Neill, as we will see in official documentation relating to her death, and this is most likely the name she wished to be known by. Lizzie lived in several places around Dublin City, including Catherine Street and Chancery Lane. But eventually she found a more permanent home at 48 Newmarket in the Liberties. The lodging house was owned by the Lynch family, and she would remain there until her death in 1925. She shared her lodgings with several other young women in a similar position to her, one of whom became her close friend. This friend was Madge Hopkins, sometimes known as Bridie. The evening of the 8th of June 1925 was one of the warmest of the year. At approximately 11 p.m, Lizzie and her friend Madge left their damp home in Newmarket and walked out into the humid summer night air. Walking along the Coombe and Dean Street in the direction of St. Stephen's Green to begin their nightly shift, they parted ways for a time on Bishop Street, but would meet up again outside the Shelburne Hotel at about 12:30 a.m. Earlier on that same day, in a small Wicklow village called Dunlavin, a superintendent of the Irish police force, known as the Civic Guard at the time, named Leopold Dillon, was struggling to start his motorbike outside the front door of Dunlavin Police Barracks. Dillon was a tall man of powerful build who had served for several years in the British Army, followed by the Free State Army. Born in Cork around the same time as Lizzie O'Neill, he had studied medicine in the hopes of becoming a doctor, but had failed his examinations and subsequently began a career in policing. His motorbike begrudgingly sputtered into life, and he slowly made his way to the nearby town of Blessington to ask a favour of his friend, one Dr. Patrick Purcell. Purcell, a man of much slighter build than Dillon, was a successful and highly respected 30-year-old general practitioner who lived and worked in Blessington, a small Wicklow town, with his wife Kathleen, about 30 kilometres southwest of Dublin. Purcell had established himself as an upstanding and respectable member of society through his busy GP practice, and, as I found in the 1925 edition of Tom's Directory, he also had become a Peace Commissioner, a position awarded by the Minister of Justice that gave him the authority to take statutory declarations and oaths, witness signatures on official documents, and even the ability to issue warrants and summons. Purcell had become a wealthy man and was able to afford the luxury of a motor car. Sometime around 1924, he had purchased a grey sports car from the Swift Motor Company of Coventry. In a time when cars were still relatively uncommon, this desirable car made Purcell stand out from the crowd and would play an intrinsic role in the events of that evening. When Dillon reached Blessington, the town summer fair was taking place, and he anxiously sought out his friend in the crowd to ask him for a loan of his car, as he had an appointment to keep in Dublin. Purcell, who despite his outward appearance of respectability, was a man who enjoyed fine whisky and beer and the company of women other than his wife. He sniffed the opportunity of a night out in Dublin and instead suggested that he and Dillon travel to the city together. In anticipation of the night ahead, the two men shared a few celebratory drinks, and Dillon, who was still wearing his uniform, went into Blessington Police Barracks, where he borrowed 2 blue overcoats for the car journey, along with a cap and a trilby hat. The two men then travelled to Naas, where the drinking continued for a while, and Dillon ditched his uniform for a shirt, tie and lounge jacket he had managed to borrow from a bank clerk. Suitably refreshed and dressed, Dillon and Purcell departed Naas and drove in the direction of Dublin City and St. Stephen's Green. The two men arrived in Dublin at about 6:30 p.m. At this time, Lizzie and Madge were still at home in Newmarket. For the next few hours, Purcell and Dillon would indulge in fine food and drink and seek out the company of the many prostitutes that operated in the Grafton Street and St. Stephen's Green area. Hungry after an afternoon of drinking and driving, they began their evening's entertainment by having dinner together at the Bailey restaurant on Duke Street, just off Grafton Street. The men then parted ways for a time when Dillon took a tram to Sandy Cove. In the meantime, Purcell drove to a pub in Donnybrook with 2 women he had encountered on Grafton Street, where they stayed for several drinks and then purchased a bottle of whiskey to take away. The trio then drove to a quiet spot on the Stillorgan Road, where Purcell and one of the women left the car for a short period, while the other woman waited in the car and drank more whiskey. He then drove both of the women home and returned to Grafton Street, where he had arranged to meet yet another woman. Following their encounter, he drove her home to Drumcondra and returned to the city centre. Dillon and Purcell reunited at the Shelburne Hotel at about 12:30 a.m, where the doctor found his superintendent friend passed out in a chair. As Purcell woke Dillon from his slumber and the two men walked out of the hotel, Lizzie O'Neill and Madge Hopkins were sitting on a chain directly opposite the Shelburne. Purcell spotted the two women and beckoned them over. The details of exactly what happened over the following few hours would be slowly revealed and argued over in a trial that riveted the nation. But for now, we need to return to Ticknock Road and the spot where 6 hours later, Felix O'Reilly made his grim discovery. Standing here now, there is a constant rumble of traffic noise from the M50 motorway that passes below the spot, and a steady flow of cars along Blackglen Road. Thousands of people have made this place their home in recent years in the nearby apartment developments. In 1925, however, the area was sparsely populated, and only a few cottages were dotted along the rural road. When Felix O'Reilly saw the blood on the unknown woman's blouse, he turned away in shock and ran towards the only landmark on the road, Lamb Doyle's pub, to raise the alarm. The pub landlord contacted the police in Stepaside Civic Guard Station, and Superintendent John Reynolds made his way to the crime scene along with Sergeant Andrew Gordon. The superintendent requested that Gordon should bring his camera along with him to document the crime scene. The county coroner was also notified, and a few hours later, Mr. J.P. Brennan arrived at the scene to conduct an inquiry. News spread quickly through Sandyford and Dundrum of the grim discovery, and within a few hours, a large crowd of people had gathered to witness the proceedings and to see the body for themselves. Sergeant Gordon took several detailed photographs of the unknown woman before the body was moved. I cannot show these photographs here in their entirety, but in the background you can clearly make out a group of curious onlookers sitting on a stone wall. The body was then taken to an outbuilding next to Lamb Doyle's pub, and an inquest was planned for the following morning. As the discovery was made early in the morning, the evening newspapers were able to include the story in that day's edition. Madge Hopkins lay in bed in Newmarket, exhausted following a long night, when a call from the city newspaper sellers echoed through the streets and in through her bedroom window. Murder in the Dublin Mountains. Murder in the Dublin Mountains. She hurriedly made her way down the hall to Lizzie's bedroom to check on her friend, only to find an empty bed, and a sudden feeling of sickness began to stir in the pit of her stomach. A brief inquest was held that day at Lamb Doyle's, as more and more people appeared at the scene. Coroner Brennan then postponed the proceedings until the following morning, and a call was placed for jurors, witnesses, and anybody who could identify the victim to attend. That evening, Madge Hopkins and a group of friends left Newmarket and began to walk in the direction of Ticknock. Also in attendance was Charles Lynch, a travelling showman whose mother owned the lodging house where Lizzie and Madge lived. As Madge approached the whitewashed outbuilding, the feeling of dread that had been rising in her stomach reached an unbearable level. She walked through the door, and there, in the dark room, surrounded by a group of people and partially covered by an old grain sack, lay her friend, Lizzie O'Neill. Lizzie had a small scar on her nose from a childhood injury, and seeing this left no doubt in Madge's mind that this was indeed her friend. The next day, a frustrated coroner Brennan began his inquest by first admonishing the people of the local community for their lack of civic spirit, as many of the requested jurors had not shown up. He then issued a £2 fine to each absentee. No medical evidence was presented at the initial inquest, but it was reported that a bullet had been found in the body. The inquest was then postponed for several weeks at the request of the police, and Coroner Brennan made the following statement. At the request of the authorities, we have to adjourn the inquest for reasons they consider necessary, and possibly by the time we meet again, the perpetrators of this atrocity may be brought to justice. It is inconceivable that a monster of that nature, responsible for the death of this unfortunate girl, could be at large in any community without some traces of his whereabouts being known. And it is up to everybody to give any information he can to the police to unfold this mystery. A newspaper article from the next day reports the following. Madge Hopkins, 48 Newmarket, identified the remains of Lizzie O'Neill, Bagnallstown, County Carlow. Witness knew the deceased for the past 5 years. She used to go under the name Honour Bright. Witness said she last saw her alive at about 3:30 a.m. on June the 9th. As the police and coroner waited for the inquest to be resumed, news of the crime spread rapidly across the country. A few days later, Leopold Dillon, having followed the progress of the story in the newspapers, prepared a statement of his version of the day's events and handed himself in at Dunlavin Barracks. The statement contained the name of his friend, Dr. Patrick Purcell, and the following day Purcell was found and arrested in Terenure. A few weeks later, a large crowd of locals gathered in Sandyford for the resumption of the coroner's inquest. Once again, those who knew Lizzie made their way towards Ticknock, and in the packed hall of Sandyford National School, a formal identification was made. The results of a post-mortem showed that Lizzie had been shot in the chest by a single 9mm bullet that had passed through her heart and lung. Death had been instantaneous, a verdict that was backed up by the peaceful expression on her face that led Felix O'Reilly to believe she was sleeping. No singe marks were visible on her clothing, meaning the gun had been fired from a distance, and absolutely no attempt was made to conceal the body, despite an abundance of gorse and ferns that grew nearby. Lizzie O'Neill's death was recorded on the register of deaths as follows: by a bullet fired at her by some person or persons at present not made identifiable, and that such person or persons were guilty of willful murder. Leopold Dillon and Patrick Purcell were charged with the murder of Lizzie O'Neill, aka Honour Bright, and will be held in custody for the next 7 months. The stage was now set for a dramatic and scandalous trial, where the events of that evening would slowly be revealed and the fate of the two suspects decided by a jury of their peers. On Monday morning, February 2nd, 1926, the trial of Leopold Dillon and Patrick Purcell began in Green Street Courthouse on the north side of Dublin City. Since its construction in 1797, the courthouse on Green Street had witnessed many of the most dramatic trials in Irish history, including that of Robert Emmet in 1803, and from the very first day of this trial, the public gallery would fill to bursting point, and over the following week, witnesses and legal professionals were forced to push their way through an ever-increasing crowd to gain access to the courtroom. Presiding over the case was Mr. Justice Sullivan. Chief prosecutor for the state was Mr. Carrigan, KC. Defence for Dillon was led by Mr. Eugene Sheehy, and defence for Purcell was led by Mr. Joseph O'Connor, KC. When questioned on their guilt by Mr. Justice Sullivan, Dillon replied, "Not guilty," while Purcell stated, "Absolutely innocent." Carrigan began his case by issuing a damning statement of the character and activities of the two men on the night in question. His speech went as follows. "You are dealing with a pair of moral degenerates who quitted their families and their responsibilities to spend a night of debauchery in Dublin City. It was only in the pages of neurotic fiction that could be found a story more disgusting. The prisoners were men who hitherto held positions of standing and responsibility in their district, one a superintendent of the police in Dunlavin, the other a dispensary doctor, and also a peace commissioner living in Blessington, apparently occupying a position befitting a young, successful and prosperous man. Between them, they murdered this unhappy girl of the unfortunate class in the early morning of the 9th of June. The circumstances of the crime formed a hideous tale of a night of debauchery, culminating in the deliberate, cold-blooded murder of one of the victims of their lust." Carrigan was convinced that Dillon and Purcell were guilty of the murder of Lizzie O'Neill. He proposed that Lizzie had been taken from the city centre in Purcell's car and then shot on Ticknock Road. Dillon and Purcell's defence claimed that the two men had left the city after spending some time with the two women and had no quarrel with either of them and had never been anywhere near Ticknock. At 12:30 a.m. that night, after Dillon had been awoken from his snooze in the hotel armchair, both he and Purcell walked out the front door of the Shelbourne and spotted Lizzie and Madge sitting on the chains across the road. They beckoned the two women over, and Purcell walked away with Madge in the direction of Hume Street, while Lizzie and Dillon sat together in Purcell's car for about 20 minutes. Dillon then started the engine of the swift motor car and spent the next 40 minutes driving around St. Stephen's Green, with Lizzie still in the car. Eventually, Patrick Purcell reappeared outside the Shelbourne Hotel, but his jovial mood had turned sour. He claimed to have been robbed of £11 and a silver cigarette case by a woman whose name he did not know. Although he had left earlier with Madge, it was not her who had robbed him. The doctor was utterly enraged and unleashed a violent outburst that was witnessed by several taxi drivers and also Madge Hopkins, who had returned to the scene. Purcell exclaimed, "I have lost a silver cigarette case that I would not wish for £20 to lose. Only had I this single note in my back pocket where I keep my revolver, she would have had that too. If I meet her again, I will do her. She wore a grey dress. I would know her, and if I don't meet her, I will take out another and leave her in the country where she will not be found. My friend is a superintendent in the police. If she tries to pass that cigarette case, he will find out. He could clear the whole green of them with his revolver. When Purcell took to the stand to be questioned by the prosecution, there were some things he was surprisingly willing to admit to, such as his encounters with the multiple working girls that night. However, when he was pushed on the blatant threat that he had made against the mystery cigarette case thief and his plan to take his anger out on a random innocent woman, he dismissed it as nothing more than drunken bravado. It is rather curious that the fate met by Lizzie O'Neill that night matches exactly what his outburst claimed would take place. Purcell had also mentioned the £1 note he kept with his gun. When asked whether he had a gun on his person that evening, he said he did not. Later in the trial, Madge Hopkins, who had witnessed the entire event and who Purcell had already relayed this story to, told the court how she asked him not to hurt the girl. As Purcell declared to Madge, "When I meet her again, I will do her in," he lifted the tail of his coat, where Madge believed she saw a gun in his back pocket. Purcell was known to own at least 2 guns, as he had taken them to the house of another friend in the Civic Guard, where the 2 men had practiced shooting. One of the guns was faulty, and the other, according to Purcell, had remained in a drawer at his home that evening. He claimed that what Madge had seen in his back pocket was a stethoscope and not a gun. According to Purcell, shortly after the heated discussion, he and Dylan had left Dublin together and driven directly to Blessington without encountering Lizzie O'Neill again. As her husband partied in Dublin city centre, Mrs. Kathleen Purcell lay awake in her bed in her family home until she was startled by the sound of the study window being opened at about 4:35 a.m. Her drunken husband clambered through the window, made himself something to eat in the kitchen, and then entered the bedroom where his wife declared, "This is a fine time for you to be coming home." Several witnesses from Blessington stated that they had heard the sound of a car travelling through the town from the direction of Dublin at about 4:30 that morning. When it was Dylan's turn to take to the stand, he, like his companion, was surprisingly open about some of the evening's events. He stated that after the time he spent with Lizzie in the car, he had paid her all the change he had in his pocket. He told the court of how he drove around the green with Lizzie, and when he eventually stopped the car near the hotel, she called out to a taxi driver she recognised. She got into the taxi and they drove away. This, according to Dylan, was the last time he saw her that night, and he noted that as the taxi pulled away, he thought he saw a man with grey hair sitting in the back of the car. Dylan also denied that he was carrying a weapon, despite the claims of witnesses who had heard Purcell say that he never went anywhere without his revolver. Of the 2 men on trial, Dylan, as a former soldier and police officer, was the more experienced man when it came to firearms. In the meantime, a taxi driver named Christopher, who earlier witnessed Purcell's outburst and also noted seeing something bulky in his pocket, left the green with Madge. The 2 travelled to a house on Parnell Street and did not see Lizzie again that night. The mystery man with grey hair in the taxi with Lizzie was never identified and was only seen by Dylan. taxi driver who picked up Lizzie O'Neill after her encounter with Dylan was identified as Ernest Woodruff, who lived on George's Street in Dunleary. Woodruff had met Lizzie before and knew her as Honor Bright. He noted that she seemed anxious, as if she was being followed. She asked him to drive her home to Newmarket, but as they passed Harcourt Road, she asked him to stop at Leonard's Corner instead, and she got out of his taxi there. According to Woodruff, there was no man with grey hair in the car. This was the last confirmed sighting of Lizzie O'Neill, and her decision to exit the taxi at Leonard's Corner would prove to be fatal. As Woodruff turned the taxi around and drove back towards the city centre, he spotted a grey sports car travelling at speed in the opposite direction on Harrington Street, going towards Leonard's Corner. Inside the car was one tall man in the passenger seat, while a smaller man sat behind the wheel. He believed the men to be Dylan and Purcell. During the investigation, Woodruff was arrested and held in custody for a week on suspicion of being involved in the death of Lizzie O'Neill, but he was released due to a lack of evidence. At this point, we need to bear in mind that Purcell and Dylan stated that they drove directly to Blessington via Rathmines and had not passed by Leonard's Corner at any point. A short time after Woodruff had seen the car on Harrington Street, a civic guard named Constable Burke, who was on foot patrol at the junction of Rathgar Avenue and Harold's Cross Road, saw a grey sports car parked up next to what he described as a dead wall under an overhanging hawthorn bush. There he saw two men and one woman speaking very loudly. The woman was asserting something very confidently, he said. Constable Burke became concerned at this point, as he could tell from a distance that the two men were completely drunk. As he drew closer to the trio, they saw him and quickly got back in the car and drove in the direction of Terranure. Once again, the men and motor car matched the description of Purcell and Dylan. However, the guard failed to make a positive identification. Counsel for the defence did their best to implicate Ernest Woodruff in an attempt to deflect guilt from Purcell and Dylan. They insinuated that Woodruff's main objective that night was not to make money from his taxi, but rather to spend the evening picking up women. There was no real evidence to show that he had any involvement in the murder. Prosecution for the state proposed that Purcell and Dylan had not returned directly to Blessington, but had instead driven past Leonard's Corner, where they spotted Lizzie O'Neill. The prosecution stated, "These men were so surfeited with drink that they were still insatiable for vice. Purcell was a reckless man. They were a pair of moral degenerates, vicious types. No decent rule of conduct could be applied to those men, who, by a devil's chance, had come across the murdered girl as she was standing at a deserted street corner. They then carried into effect the threats made by Purcell, and I asked the jury to find accordingly." During the trial, the bullet that had killed Lizzie was produced in court, and it was shown that the 9mm round was not fired by the guns known to be owned by the two suspects. It is possible, of course, that both Purcell and Dylan owned another weapon that they did not tell the court about. When the overcoats the men had borrowed were examined, police found pieces of briars in the pockets of one and stains on the back of one of the coats. The area where Lizzie was found in 1925, as it is today, was covered by briars. Inspector O'Connell stated, "There was a stain on the back of the coat, and in one of the pockets I found a little piece of briar. I found some briar leaves adhering to the coat." When Inspector O'Connell visited the crime scene, he stated that the bank towards which the women's feet were pointing when found was composed of briar heads. Had Dr. Patrick Purcell and Superintendent Leo Dillon departed St. Stephen's Green following a night of debauchery and driven straight home to Blessington, or had they instead taken Lizzie O'Neill from Leonard's Corner to Ticknock Crossroads? An agent from the Swift Motor Company was employed to recreate the journey from St. Stephen's Green to Blessington in the same type of car, and he reported that it took exactly 1 hour and 10 minutes at that time of night. When questioned on the time they arrived back in Blessington, Purcell and Dillon contradicted each other. Dillon claimed they arrived at 4 a.m, while Purcell said it was 4:30 a.m. It is difficult to work out exactly what time they left Dublin, as they were both rather vague on the matter. The third and final day of the trial had been particularly long, and it was not until 9 p.m. that the jury left the courtroom to consider the verdict. As everyone prepared for a long wait, and more than likely another day in court, they were instead shocked to see the members of the jury reappear after only 3 minutes. A verdict had been reached without hesitation. Dr. Patrick Purcell and Superintendent Leopold Dillon were not guilty. After 7 months of custody and a 3-day trial, the two men were officially discharged and were free to leave the court. The following day, a newspaper told of the speedy acquittal. For Purcell and Dillon, despite being found not guilty, their lives in Ireland were effectively over. The scandalous behaviour they had admitted to on that June evening horrified most members of society. While Purcell was held in custody before the trial, his wife, Kathleen, was left to face the music in Blessington. She found herself to be a pariah and was even refused service in the town's shops. On his return, Purcell found that his patient list had dwindled and that there was no hope of resuming his former life. He was forced to emigrate to England and never returned. Leopold Dillon's promising career in the police ended before the trial even began. Shortly after he handed himself in, he was dismissed from the force. He too would leave the country to escape the scandal, with some reports saying that he emigrated to Canada. There will be no justice for Lizzie O'Neill, and her murder on the 9th of June 1925 remains to this day unsolved. Following the grim discovery on the 9th of June, Lizzie's body was kept in the outbuilding of Lambdoyle's for a few days, in the hopes that a family member would come forward to claim the body. Unfortunately, this did not happen. Perhaps the few family members she had left in Ireland did not hear of the death on time, or they simply did not have the means to travel to Dublin to collect her body. On the 11th of June 1925, Lizzie O'Neill was taken on her final journey to Kilgobbin Cemetery, a short distance from Ticknock, and was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave that was paid for by the authorities, as a small number of her friends from Newmarket looked on. For the next few years, her friends made the journey from Dublin City Centre to Kilgobbin Cemetery on the anniversary of her death. But as the years passed, Lizzie's story was slowly forgotten, along with the exact location of her unmarked grave in the cemetery. It is believed that she was buried next to a bank at the rear of the cemetery, but as records for the cemetery do not begin until a few years after her death, it is difficult to confirm exactly where. There are a number of unmarked plots next to the bank at the presumed gravesite. For now, at least, this is the closest I can get to finding Lizzie O'Neill. Rest in peace, Lizzie. Today, the only marker of her life is the plaque on the wall in Ticknock that bears the name of her pseudonym, Honor Bright. In the 1920s, there was little sympathy for women like Lizzie, who were forced to make impossible decisions just to survive. For many, the idea of a young woman living an independent life in the city, away from the eyes of her parents and the parish priest, was a frightening prospect. This sentiment was reflected in a sermon-like article published in The Independent in 1926, in which the anonymous author warns other young women of the fate that awaits them. We must not waste words over this unfortunate girl. We must not excite pity by indulging in mawkish sentimentality. The fate of that poor creature in the lonely grave in the countryside should serve as a text so powerful and as a sermon that could be preached to this day. It would be vile, stupid, and ridiculous to suggest that the case of Honor Bright reflect anything like the normal life of the people of this country. The horrible fate of Honor Bright is the potential downfall of many girls now living in towns and cities of Ireland. for the road she took in her days of innocent girlhood is the road now followed by many other girls of her age and her class. Let them halt and think and pray and turn back. The article goes on to tell of how Lizzie arrived in Dublin as a good and decent girl, but her downfall truly began when she tasted alcohol at a dance and began to associate with male companions. Lizzie O'Neill's son, Kevin Barry, grew up in the care of Margaret McGill. According to his daughter, Patricia Hughes, he did not learn of his mother's identity until he joined the army and saw his original surname of O'Neill on his birth certificate. He would return to Ireland from England in the 1960s to try and find out more about his mother's life, but found that the authorities were not interested in helping him, with the exception of giving him the bullet that killed his mother. How exactly did the jury reach their verdict so quickly? Perhaps the lack of a gun that matched the bullet was the deciding factor, or maybe the prospect of convicting a police officer of murder in the early years of the Free State was simply too much of an embarrassment on the international stage. A shocking new theory on the case was revealed in a book written by Lizzie's granddaughter Patricia Hughes many years later. In her book, Who Killed Honor Bright, Hughes proposes that the death of her grandmother was not a random murder, but was instead an elaborate cover-up organised by the state to protect famous poet and senator of the Free State, William Butler Yeats, and that Dylan had acted as an assassin. W.B. Yeats, a world-renowned poet and Nobel Prize winner, was also a senator of the Irish Free State. Hughes proposes in her book that he had a long-standing relationship with Lizzie O'Neill, despite being married to Georgie Hyde-Lees Yeats at the time, and that he was the father of her baby. An elaborate plan to eliminate Lizzie and the possibility of her son making a claim on the Yeats estate was organised by Georgie and W.B. Yeats. Using his position of influence as a senator, Superintendent Dillon was hired to kill Lizzie O'Neill. Hughes claims that Lizzie had never been a prostitute, and this narrative was created to discredit her in court, so that Dillon would be found not guilty. In this version of events, Purcell had been used by Dillon to gain access to his car, and he had no knowledge of the plot. She also claims that the postponement of the initial inquest was requested by Owen O'Duffy, the Commissioner of the Civic Guard, to give the authorities time to create a new story in which Lizzie was painted as a prostitute. There is no evidence to back up her theory, as she admits in her book, and DNA testing would be required to prove a biological relationship to Yeats. In the absence of physical evidence, Hughes analysed the poetry of Yeats, in which she says he frequently referred to his secret relationship with Lizzie O'Neill. According to Hughes, in his poem Among School Children, published in 1928, Yeats is reminded of Lizzie and her son during a visit to the school in his role as a senator. Above a sinking fire, a tale that she told of a harsh reproof or trivial event that changed some childish day to tragedy, told, and it seemed that our two natures blent into a sphere from youthful sympathy, or else to alter Plato's parable into the yolk and white of one shell. And thinking of that fit of grief or rage, I look upon one child or t'other there, and wonder if she stood so at that age. For even daughters of the swan can share something of every paddler's heritage, and had that colour upon cheek or hair, and thereupon my heart is driven wild. She stands before me as a living child. It seems unlikely that such an elaborate scheme and cover-up could have been organised simply to protect the reputation of W.B. Yeats, and the chances of DNA testing ever taking place are fairly slim. The records of the trial also show that the prosecution for the state were actually quite determined to have the two men found guilty. For now, the murder of Lizzie O'Neill remains unsolved. Was her death caused by two drunk and entitled men? Or was it an elaborate assassination plot that was hatched to protect W.B. Yeats and his wife? Let me know in the comments what you think. I'd love to hear your opinion.